Hello and welcome to a special edition of Spectator TV. I'm Katy Balls and I'm joined by Fraser Nelson, and we have just had Boris Johnson's evidence session to the Privileges Committee. There were a few things to note in what was quite a lengthy session, around 4 hours, a few breaks for going for votes, but I think just to run through a few highlights before we discuss them, Fraser, we had Boris Johnson explaining that it was essential there are drinks in the form of a leaving do at one point in order to make sure relations weren't acrimonious.
It was necessary because two senior members of staff, the effective chief of staff and the director of communications, had both left the building or were about to leave the building in pretty acrimonious circumstances, or what were potentially acrimonious circumstances. It was important for me to be there and to give reassurance.
You declined to repeat some of the claims in the press by supporters of him that the Privileges Committee amounts to a kangaroo court.
Have you characterised us as a kangaroo court?
You can tell by my presence this afternoon, by the seriousness with which I've taken your questions, by my attempts to answer in detail the points you've put to me, how seriously I take you and your committee.
And he said with hindsight, he realised that infamous bring your own booze party in the garden would not have looked so good if someone had looked over the wall at the time.
I can't say. I think he was concerned about the impression that people might gain if they looked over the garden wall, if they were coming from the media room, and thought that we were doing something that other people weren't allowed to do. And I in my opening remarks, I made clear that I can see why people might have felt that way.
Fraser, you've been watching the sessions. Were you impressed by either side, Boris Johnson or the committee?
It was quite a depressing spectacle on every angle, actually. You had Harriet Harman, the chairman, very much getting into her dramatic role as the judge here, setting her up. It was a great lengthy prelude, talking about the importance of truth in Parliament, etc. And then very, very quickly gets down in the weeds. What did you know and why? Who did you say? And it's quite easy just to lose track of this. And of course, it's strange to see so much attention here. You've got all of Parliament's watching this. The televisions have cleared 3 or 4 hours for it, all on whether Boris Johnson knowingly misled the House. He's admitted that he misled the House. He's lost his job as a result of it. He had to quit in disgrace. So the punishment has come. He's now game over for him as a politician. And yet, this is now becoming one of the most dramatic political moments of the year so far. We didn't even learn anything new. I think Boris Johnson himself pointed out that in 10 months, the committee hadn't managed to find a shred of evidence to contradict his claim that when he said that all rules were being observed, he didn't know anything to the contrary. And if you know Boris, you know that's probably quite likely, because he operates in this sort of buffer zone of vagueness where he always wants plausible deniability. He's done this throughout his life in politics and even before that. He likes to not get into trouble by pretending he didn't really know what was going on in the first place. So it's completely plausible that this cloud of confusion was strategically assembled around him through most of his time in number 10, with pretty bad consequences for the country, but it does help him claim no knowledge now.
Now, as you say, in a way, there weren't really bombshell revelations in that session because, in part, so much was covered during the time. I think at one point, one of Boris Johnson's defences was, well, everyone keeps talking about the birthday party, which is what he was fined for, but that originally was uncovered not by the Mirror or ITV as part of Partygate, but was the introduction to a Saturday Times read when it was used as a little bit of colour about what was going on in the pandemic response, as evidence in Boris Johnson's mind that, well, clearly people didn't think they were doing too much wrong because it was briefed as soft colour. But we did have evidence put forward before the session started, and yesterday Boris Johnson's evidence and his defence, and then this morning I think a few trickier things. So you have Simon Case, the top civil servant, beleaguered top civil servant perhaps is a better way to put it, ultimately saying that he didn't tell Boris Johnson all guidance had been followed. You have Jack Doyle, his former director of communications, raising similar concerns. And then you have Martin Reynolds, who at the time, I think has had the nickname Party Marty over the Bring Your Own Booze party, saying that when it came to what Boris Johnson said in the House, which is ultimately what this all comes to, the statements Boris Johnson made in the House of Commons, where he said all the rules and guidance had been followed, that he had advised Boris Johnson not to say that, and he had done so regardless. So that's probably the trickier claims, which is if Boris Johnson wants to talk about all the fact that no one told him specifically, listen, he was following the advice of his close team. There are members of his close team who seem to dispute or at least question this idea that he was being told everything was okay all the time. But did you get a sense of a smoking gun today?
Not proving his guilt, no. There was lots to cast doubt in his version of events. But when you look at what the tests the committee has to come up with here, can they be confident? So confident that they would risk suspending him from Parliament and perhaps kicking him out as an MP? Can they be that confident that he lied when he said he didn't know? Certainly, for all the things that you mentioned, you can very much doubt that Boris was really confident to say there wasn't one. But again, you come back to the vagueness. Again, his strategic vagueness. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for a majority on that committee to rule that they are clear that Boris Johnson knowingly misled the House. There's no evidence to point to. All you've got is your gut feeling. Now, there's so many things that annoy me about this. And the most annoying thing is I just think the whole thing is so trivial compared to the things which we should be discussing. We got a cover story in the Spectator tomorrow, for example, that there are 140,000 pupils now effectively absent from school after lockdown. Where's the debate about that? And people seem very uninterested in that's a really important issue. Now, we all know that Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons. We all know that his officials who were making these rules were breaking them themselves. So in a way, it seems to be a huge amount of attention over something which is, first of all, relatively trivial, and secondly, probably is not going to lead anywhere anyway, because there's no evidence suggesting that he knowingly misled the House. But then again, when I was looking at it, now and again, because it got so ridiculous, you were almost tempted to feel sorry for him. But then you have to remember all of the people who were basically arrested and fined due to his ridiculous rules in the first place. The pensioners who were fined £200 for eating a bag of chips in a laundrette. The women who had police coming after them for having a cup of coffee when they went for a walk together. Tens of thousands of offences during these ridiculous rules. And people were not able to say to the police, as Boris Johnson is saying now, there's a get-out clause because of this, that and the other. What we saw throughout this was perhaps what I regard as the biggest outrage about lockdown. For those in the know, there was always a get-out clause. There was always, this is a work function. For example, he was saying about the leaving do. It was absolutely essential, he's saying, that I gathered my staff to salute somebody who was leaving. It's in the customs of these islands that we raise a glass and toast somebody who's leaving the party. It was necessary as a leader to raise morale amongst the staff. All of these things are true, but he made it illegal for anybody else to do that. So him claiming that it was essential that he was to have a leaving do to raise morale, it's not that I disagree with him. I think those things are essential. But anybody else who had done that would have had the police come after him thanks to his rules. And when you remember that, you do tend to think to yourself, well, in this case, he does deserve everything he's getting.
And I think it was another reminder of some of the evidence Boris Johnson gave. So when he was talking about the Bring Your Own Booze party, saying at the time, you have to understand, it just did not cross my mind. I just thought this was a work event. And lots of people laugh and say, that's ridiculous. There were trestle tables. There were lots of people at stands. They're one of the merriest things probably anyone was doing in the country on that day. But then you look at it from a different perspective, and I don't mean this to make excuses for Boris Johnson particularly, but if you were working in number 10, you had such a different experience than the rest of the country when it comes to lockdown.
Well, for a start, they were all in the office,
right? Exactly. Lots of people never really spent a day at home. They were seeing their colleagues. I've spoken to people who were working in number 10 who felt in a way they had this separate bubble. It was almost a number 10 bubble where, it was different rules because they were seeing each other so frequently. So many of them had COVID themselves. They felt as though they had immunity. But of course, every time you hear this, you just go back to the point, well, but you didn't make it so if someone had COVID, they could go out and do things. So why would that, it was different rules. So I think that would potentially, even if you don't agree with the logic, work in Boris Johnson's favour for the fact people did just see things quite differently. But I think it's also the case when you're looking at this Privileges Committee, which clearly was, box office today. It's going to be in the papers all of tomorrow. But it does feel, this committee was first raised when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. So if this was taking place when Boris Johnson was still in number 10, I think it'd be much more high stakes, obviously. Instead, I think and you can see, I think in Tory activist polling, there is a sense some people think Boris Johnson has had punishment enough. Now, the committee, lots of MPs will say, it's not about punishment, it's about truth, it's about what ministers are expected to do. But I think the circumstances that this has now come to be in as a result of, the fact he was pushed out, Liz Truss, now Rishi Sunak, means that it just doesn't feel as though it has the same weight as it would have done otherwise. And you do begin to wonder what happens if the committee finds against Boris Johnson and recommends a long suspension, because, of course, if they recommend a suspension of 10 days or more, 10 sitting days, then he's vulnerable to a recall petition. There could be a by-election. Do you think there'd be anger at that point towards Boris Johnson or sympathy? Do you think he'd lose the seat?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. If he gets suspended for 10 days, there will be recall petition and Labour will fight it like a general election. Now, as you write in your political column, Katy, the embarrassing thing is that Rishi Sunak would really have to go out there and campaign for Boris Johnson to stay. And it would be a humiliation for the Conservatives. So it's part of Labour's strategy right now to hang the lockdown parties around Rishi Sunak's neck. This is why it's so strategically important for Harriet Harman and everyone else in the Labour Party to make as much as they can about saying, that's not ancient history, this is the Conservative Party. The ones standing for election next year are going to be the ones who locked you all down and had lots of parties themselves. So they want to do everything they can to make Boris Johnson not ancient history, but a current Tory saga. That's why it all depends on the 4 Tories in that committee, only 7 members of them. So 4 Tories can effectively veto if they were to vote together. Now, there's lots of guessing as to where they are. We know that many of them are not great fans of Boris Johnson. But then again, would they really want to, knowing as they do, that if they give him a 10-day suspension, then they will be humiliating defeat for the party. That's likely to follow pretty quickly. So this is, and when I saw today's, I actually did wonder if there would be some smoking gun, if his evidence would come out with something that would prove what they need to prove, that he absolutely knew that there were parties when he said there weren't. Absent any such evidence, you would need pretty strong animus towards Boris Johnson to say that in all probability he was actively telling a lie. And you would also need for those 4 Conservatives, because let's not pretend they're all neutral here. They know that they're all, I forget if all 4 of them are fighting their seats again at the next election. But if they are, it's not within their interests for the Tory party to go through the debacle of losing a former Prime Minister and having Labour triumphant in Boris Johnson's old seat. So I'm now reasonably sure that the committee will not find to give him a 10-day suspension. They might give him a 7-day, or they might not even give him anything at all. But if there are 7 MPs, 4 of them are Tories, and they lack that smoking gun evidence, as we've seen today, the process can be very damaging for him. The process can be very embarrassing for the Conservatives, but I think they will stop short of inflicting on themselves the blow of losing a former Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think if you did get to that by-election point, so if these MPs did decide to go for a 10-day suspension, well, to me that is potentially lose to Rishi Sunak either way, because say Boris Johnson somehow pulls out the bag and wins that by-election, you can just imagine how that's going to galvanise his supporters who will say, we told you he was an election winner, look at all the runs of by-election defeats, and now look what Boris Johnson has done. And then if he loses it, Rishi Sunak will probably be accused of not putting enough funds into defending the seat, and Boris Johnson could be pitched as a Brexit martyr, someone the establishment pushed out because they didn't like him. So you can sense that in number 10 at least, I think avoiding that would be preferable, not that they have a direct say in it. The other news just finally today, Fraser, relates to Rishi Sunak's Brexit deal. Well, and actually his tax return, let's try and rattle through both very quickly. So I suppose actually before we get to the Brexit deal, Rishi Sunak's obviously said he's a politician of integrity, but he also still has learnt some of the key tricks of the trade, which is get out potentially bad news when there's a lot going on. So there is, we found out today that around 4 p.m, Rishi Sunak would be releasing his tax return, something he's promised to do, but it's taken quite a long time to do. Obviously right in the middle of Boris Johnson's evidence. Did anything strike you about it?
I didn't expect, well, obviously we know that if an MP earns money, he has to declare it. So a tax return shouldn't tell you if an MP is earning lots of money on the side. That should be impossible under our system. But what I didn't work out was that Rishi Sunak was so incredibly wealthy in his own right that him simply buying and selling shares every year would give him, in this case, a profit of £1.6 million. That's simply him keeping his portfolio from day to day. For 2 years running, he made capital gains of that amount. Of course, he paid full tax on it. But we all know that his wife is richer than the king. And that's sort of famous. And the impression is that Rishi married into this insanely wealthy family. But no, set her aside. Rishi Sunak would be the richest man in his own right ever to sit, I think, in 10 Downing Street, because of the incredible amount of money he must have earned before he came into Parliament in 2010.
And just as the final item, we have a situation where the Windsor Framework was finally voted on. It was a rebellion. Just over 20 Tory MPs voted against it. I think around 48 Tory MPs abstained. Now, depending on who you speak to, this was a huge success for Rishi Sunak. And to be fair to Rishi Sunak, there were warnings, I think, in February saying up to 100 Tory MPs could actively vote against any deal on the protocol. But the European Research Group have done their own analysis, and they said, well, if you count the abstentions as no votes, then the Tory working majority would go if every opposition MP voted against it, though I think on the numbers today, the Tories would still have been fine. Do you think that's a decent result for Rishi Sunak?
I think he'd be quite pleased, yes. I mean, the rebels were not the usual crowd. You had 3 former party leaders. Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Ian Duncan-Smith. So Priti Patel. There was an all-star cast.
Jake Berry.
People who we know loathe Rishi Sunak. So looking at that, you're trying to work out, is there a new awkward squad here? But I can't quite... To me, it looked like a lot of sort of retired grandees. I mean, IDS, for example, almost certainly won't be in Parliament at the next election. Other than Jake Berry, I couldn't see much of a growing kind of Andy Sunak squad there. I think he'd be quite pleased that it was only 20. This was a very controversial piece of legislation. Even the DUP voted against it. And if the DUP voted against it, once upon a time you'd have thought, well, in that case, a whole bunch of Tory Brexiteers are going to vote against it out of solidarity with the DUP. That didn't really happen. So all told, I think this is looking to be quite a good week for Rishi Sunak. Not only is he incredibly wealthy, but his political position in the party is quite secure. Because if you did want to get rid of him, you would vote against him now. To destabilise him on a signature deal would be a major way of weakening him. And only 20 of his MPs, less than 10%, chose to do that.
Thank you, Fraser. Thank you for watching.